All right, let's go. Based Rousseau, although I have to preview to what's about to happen because I never knew that Eric had this opinion, but we are actually going to have a disagreement about Rousseau pretty soon.
Do you think cringe Rousseau would be as clickbaity of a title?
It might be. I was gonna say I was gonna use that word to describe some of my reactions to what he was saying.
Rousseau is cringe?
Yeah, cringe Rousseau or
Rousseau
based
is
Rousseau.
based and underrated.
I mean, I can tell you, I'm starting to see why this one didn't win the award for the writing contest.
It came
in
got
second.
second place.
Didn't win first.
Do you know he died? He's like considered the cause for the French Revolution, and I think he died like the year before, something like
Is that true?
Is he like the cause?
That's funny.
Well, we're gonna get to
We're gonna
interpretations of it, but before we got so much leftist news, and we've not covered news in a while.
Yeah,
I feel like leftist internet is experiencing a sort of crack up, you know, in the post Bernie, because Cornel West is running for president, and apparently he did problematic. No, he didn't do problematic things, but the party is problematic that he's doing.
Yeah,
By the way,
I wish...
listener, we're Canadian. We're Canadian. This is purely just entertainment for us.
I wish he would have just run in the Democratic primary. Like, I don't know. I just think that would have been better.
Well, they asked him these questions. You got to watch like his interview on Democracy Now! Or something, like why he chose to go with a third party instead of one of the. Well, he's calling the Dems and the GOP a corporate duopoly. So clearly, like his platform is not gonna.
True.
To run with one of them. And then he said, you know, he was there at the founding of this party, and he's been like a listed member of it for all these years, but he hasn't been involved. And so all those things that have supposedly, you know, come out about the People's Party thing were in his absence. And he just kind of went on about how, accountability, we need accountability, but like, we also need to like build this movement and look to the future kind of stuff. He had a pretty good way of spinning it. I don't know.
Do you have any idea what is the thing that came out about I just think they sound like libertarian Bitcoin bros a little bit too much. Is that the extent of it, or is it worse?
I'm actually not. I can't remember what exactly happened.
All right. Well, there you have it, listeners. You came here for your Twitter leftist news, and we don't know shit.
Yeah, exactly.
But we might get to know it a little bit better because we're not allowed outside. There's an air warning. Did you know that? If you're old, asthmatic, or pregnant, you can't go outside in Toronto because nature set itself on fire.
Did you guys see pictures of New York though? Actually looks like literal hell there.
Yeah, it's like orange. It's like got a nuclear horizon there.
It's way worse there.
I think this is a stunt for the Diablo 4 release.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw
Some
that.
crazy fucking marketing campaign.
Well, I really want to get done editing this and release it so I can go play Diablo. But
did you guys see the?
Sorry, how did New York turn orange if the fires are in Quebec? Or am I screwing
It's just
up my
the wind
geography?
streams. You gotta learn some meteorology about like jet streams and stuff. That's like, you know, jet streams go in weird directions, and for whatever reason, the jet stream went right to New York City. It was I don't know if you guys saw, like, someone tweeted, like, I don't know if it was an ironic like conspiracy theory, but it was like a satellite video of the fires in like Quebec and Ontario, and like it kind of looks like they all started at the same time, but they're in different places, and they're like, look, like they lit them on purpose. It's like some kind of thing, some kind of conspiracy theory that they're like, this isn't a coordinated attack.
I mean, I think the main point is that it's so dry because of climate change.
Yeah,
if you lit all those fires under different conditions, it wouldn't be so bad. So there goes that theory. But
no, I think it's because the French, especially the rural Quebecers, they're like, you're going to tell me I cannot throw my cigarette out the window? Fuck you! I throw my cigarette out the window.
It's caused by
C'est interdit.
Canadians.
Je m'en fiche.
So that's a very French accent, by the way.
Well, I don't know how to do the Quebecer. Oh, Quebecer.
My cigarettes, huh?
Coming up, we're going to learn why the French are like that. Why they just do things, break rules for the sake of breaking them. It all goes back to Rousseau.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, he was a big influence on the French Revolution. That's true.
I don't know what Quebec was like when he was writing. I assume he'd never been. But
Well, it would have
maybe,
been New France back then.
True that.
Anyway,
Yeah.
it's on fire and you can't go outside. So
Yeah, they're saying wear N95 masks if you need to be outside for long periods of time. Telling us to stay inside.
I wonder who's that gonna upset.
But now that it's for your health instead of to protect other people will do it. It's like now it's going to protect you from the particulates, even though only an N95 will do that. Wearing a regular mask won't do fucking shit except make you look like a badass. But otherwise, it's all the coverage. You know, they still. It's like, okay, it seems like we've all accepted that climate change is real. Finally, even the right. And yet you see in the coverage still, it's not welcome. The topic is still not welcome. They're still not going to connect it to climate change. And even like our fucking premier of Ontario, Ford, refused to make the connection even.
Yeah, they've said climate change is real, but it's woke. So fuck it.
Yeah. He said, stop politicizing the issue. He said, do you find it connected to climate change? He said, that's politicizing the issue. I'm like, yeah, because the forest requires it to be politicized. Like, it doesn't impact, like, you're a politician and this is a problem and you're elected to solve problems. How is this not politics? Like, I'm like, sorry, who are you and what are you doing in front of me right now on television? Oh, you're a fucking politician and this is a fucking problem. Therefore, it is politics. You can't just decide what's politics and what's not. Sorry, got out of control there. But yeah, climate change.
You made the
awesome.
primal error there, which is caring, Eric.
I know. I did the thing that you freak out like the Scientology BBC journalist who got baited. Same thing with climate change.
Well, before we get to French and all things French, I learned something about English this week, and I rarely learn things about English because I was raised speaking it, of course. But it was okay, this is mind-blowing. I want to give you guys a little test because I learned that they learn this in like ESL classes, you know, when they I don't know, they're immigrating or whatever. You have to learn this as a thing that I totally know, but I had no idea that I knew about the English language. And that's an adjective word order.
An adjective word order.
So if you have a bunch of adjectives on a noun, there's a proper order to put them in.
Oh, is it like time, space, cause kind of stuff?
I'll give it to you and see if you know. Like everybody knows it without ever being taught it, but people who are not native English speakers have to learn it. So I'll give you, maybe you need a piece of paper for this, but if I give you a bunch of adjectives and a noun, right? So the noun is alpha male. Now the alpha male is white, American, short, and diluted. Now, what's the proper adjective order for those? White, American, short, diluted.
I thought it would be short, white, diluted American.
I don't know if I didn't know that there's a correct order for that.
But there is.
I didn't know that.
Short, that's my guess. Short, white, diluted American.
No, alpha male is the noun.
Oh.
But he is also
short,
American.
white, diluted American alpha male. Yeah, just stick it on the end.
That's your final answer?
Short, white, diluted American alpha male. Yeah, that's my chosen order.
I agree.
That is correct. So the actual word order is opinion goes first, size goes second, then age. Oh, actually, it should be. Oh no,
diluted?
I understand. Technically, it would be diluted, short, white American alpha male.
Diluted on the front.
Because diluted is your opinion of the person. But then size comes next, then age, then shape, then color, then origin, which is American, material, purpose, and then qualifiers. So the qualifier is alpha. So alpha and male always have to be together. But your opinion about it is diluted. then the size would be short. And then
Wait, so
white
we make ESL people waste their time learning this. Who cares? This is so stupid.
if you say it wrong, it's very
But
noticeable.
Eric just said it wrong, and it was no problem.
No, because
Yeah.
this one's because he technically added diluted as a qualifier to alpha male. So diluted alpha male could be a qualifier. So it's not. I can give you another one.
Yeah, give me another example because I'm not seeing the importance here at all.
So this is a journal article is the noun. It's of political philosophy. It's new. It's boring, and it's verbose.
Okay.
So give me verbose, new, boring, political philosophy in the correct order.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, I don't know.
Verbose, new, boring.
I would say
Boring,
this
new,
is like
verbose.
boring. I guess it would be like a boring.
It's new, boring, verbose.
It's a boring, new, and verbose.
Yeah, boring would probably come first. 'cause
You forgot
that's
political philosophy as an
Oh,
adjective.
boring. Yeah, boring, new, verbose political philosophy.
Yeah, like political philosophy sounds like the noun here now.
Or new. I mean, I don't know. I guess it would be boring first. I don't know. I've never thought about it.
Yeah, well, you're correct. Again, it would be borings first because that's your opinion of it. Verbose is the quality, so I can go last. But new
is
it has
temporal.
to be political philosophy has to be last. It has to be a political philosophy journal article. You can't say a political philosophy boring new journal article.
Or is
right.
boring. Yeah. No, of course. That
Because
part
that's a
makes sense
noun
to me.
phrase. That would be a political philosophy journal article would be a noun phrase. That would
And I know in other languages they do reverse that order, right? Like the whatever the fucking terms are.
It makes sense because, like, you know, you develop the language when you're born into it, so you just get an ear for these things, and then someone comes along and points them out to you, and it's like, wow, holy shit. And then obviously you teach the other way around. You try to like expose the structural principles and then like fit the everyday stuff into that. But it's like when someone comes along and asks you the question, like, how come it's always ding dong and not dong ding? There must be something in the I-O progression that is more pleasing. Like I've seen articles and linguists studying that sort of stuff too. It's like, how come certain verb orders are just more, you know, they just sound right and others sound wrong. Even if there's no rules against that, it's just silly. If you just said, what sound does a clock make? Talk tick? No, that's wrong. Clocks don't make that sound. Well, they don't say tick tock either, so who gives a fuck?
Well, think of how wrong it sounds if you say an American fat ugly guy as opposed to a fat ugly American guy.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it would be weird to be like, he's ugly fat American.
I think ugly fat American
first.
guy makes a lot more sense than an American fat ugly guy. Or an American
But a fat ugly American? But yeah, ugly is supposed to come first?
Yeah.
Well, American
American
would
is
be
to me-
last.
American has to come last in that one.
Well, I understand that part, like that the subject or whatever I don't know. I'm like really bad with like grammar words because I was a terrible student in elementary school. I didn't learn how to write. Like I didn't pay attention to any school. So like when I got to university, I don't know like grammar words because I just skipped it. I wasn't paying attention. Then when I got to university, I just got good at writing essays without knowing the rules behind them.
Well, this is very easy because they're all
Yeah.
adjectives and one noun. But there's such a thing as like a qualifier adjective, which is
Sure.
alpha male. Alpha always has to go next to male if you're talking about an alpha male. You can't go
I get that, but
alpha
but I don't.
short male.
I would have no problem though if someone was like, you know, an ugly fat, or if they said fat ugly American. I feel like actually that would be what people would say, even though that's technically incorrect. Versus
No, that is correct because you turned American into
fat, ugly American?
You turned American into the noun, but I said American.
but aren't you
guy.
supposed to say ugly? Aren't you supposed to say ugly fat American, not fat ugly American?
Yeah, I think
ugly
that would
fat
be the
American?
opinion piece.
Because that's your opinion
no,
about their ugliness.
you changed the noun to American when it was guy, where you can't start with
American
an-
guy, right?
You can't say an American fat ugly guy.
Oh yeah, right. An American fat ugly. That would be weird. I agree with that. That would be strange to be like, American fat ugly guy. Like you might say like, well, obviously it would be different, but you might say like, oh, that American was really fat and ugly. That's different though. Yeah.
Anyway, the meaning is all there, but the order somehow matters. And I don't think there's any reason that they're in that order. It's probably just evolutionary.
Yeah, it's cultural.
But we've spent some time on it. Okay.
That's also, it's funny. Like when I was in school and I was talking about how I was a terrible student, like this was the kind of shit that made me a bad student too, because I think I just had like an anti-establishment kind of like curiosity and allergic reaction to things that seemed arbitrary. So I remember being in grammar school and grade school and they'd be like, well, we just do it this way because that's why. And I would just be like, so fucking stupid. Like, who cares? I was like, I can remember. It's like bringing me back to being young and being like, these are such stupid pedantic rules that like don't matter. And like,
I think that's why they stopped teaching it to native speakers.
You started anti-establishment and then you became a lib. Which
am I pro-establishment?
Today, no, I'm just fucking with you. Today we're talking to the anarchists. How you doing, anarchists? We're getting to
Rousseau's
David.
Definitely not an anarchist.
No, we're getting to David Graeber, but starting with Rousseau because Graeber references him.
Graeber and
hundreds
Wengrow.
of the Davids. Yeah,
yeah.
They reference him
Rousseau's
hundreds of times in The Dawn of Everything. So
in their book, yeah, it's like the founding kind of ideas are kind of worked out with. This text, the origins of what's it called? On the
inequality, the discourse on the origins of inequality among men.
Discourse on the origins, right?
Of inequality.
Yeah, add those extra words in there, Rousseau. Thank you.
Put those adjectives in proper
The origin of inequality, yeah,
among men.
So this kicked off. Well, I'm sure everybody's got some idea about Rousseau and what he's all about.
I'm very surprised to hear that Eric has never read this before after doing a humanities PhD.
Hey, yeah, I'd have to go back through my old like history of ideas course packs and see if he was in there. He must have been in there. He must have been in there on the like Enlightenment or the Romanticist kind of modules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's preface this a little bit because we're looking at whether or not civilization was inevitable. It's spoken of often as if it were inevitable, and it feels like the state is everywhere, that it's eternal, that we have one political form, it doesn't change, that it never changes. But this was not always the case, and that's kind of the point of the Graeber book, is they had seasonal changes, they had migratory changes where you'd go off part of the year and become part of some social gathering, and then another part of the year, seasonally, you would become part of a larger group. So we have a concept of a eternal police state, and that wasn't always the case. And why are we choosing to do this? I don't know. We didn't really decide. I guess Eric decided.
Yeah, I was pushing for it because we've been doing a lot of Marx kind of stuff, post-Marxism, and I wanted to look into anarchism. And I think David Graeber is a very good and well-respected example. But then just them collaborating on this book, The Dawn of Everything, it was super interesting to me because the timing was basically like I'm looking into material culture theory, so I'm looking into archaeological and anthropological theories. So a lot of these things are coming up in the specialist literature. But then people still, in the popular understanding, or when you read the big ideas kinds of history books or the big history books, they repeat the old myths. They repeat the old platitudes, the old kinds of, just popular understanding stories about human development. And they never criticize those kinds of narratives, or they interpret the evidence really, really narrowly to fit into one of those molds. And the two famous molds we have are the Hobbes mold, where, state of nature, man against man, life is nasty, brutish, and short. And then you have the Rousseau mold, where it's the other way around. There's a state of innocence in nature. And then agriculture is the first sort of stage. And then we slowly have to, in our run towards freedom, we chain ourselves kind of approach. And so society has all these issues that we're Well, this was his thought experiment, as we'll emphasize. This is not Rousseau attempting to actually tell us about what's happened in history, but slowly over the decades, it has sort of become a story of what actually happened. Even though he announces quite clearly he's not telling us this, but it has kind of just, we forgot that part, and it morphed into one of our explanations. And people now, you have Rousseauians and Hobbesians, and they stick to these stories in various ways. And the point is, they're both wrong. They were never meant to be history in the first place.
Get out of here. I've never heard of a single, my entire life, adult life in academia, I have never heard of a Rousseauian.
Oh, I mean, they exist.
I have heard of the Marxists. I have heard of the Leninists. I have heard of the anarchists. Never a Rousseauian. And actually, I'm going to make the case that this is sad. I read Rousseau for this episode, and I got stoked, which is why he's based. I know you disagree, Eric, but actually, probably the most well-read on Rousseau is politics guy, Victor. What happened when you taught this?
Yeah, so I mean, Rousseau is, I think, really important in the history of political thought. Like Eric was saying, there's like the kind of trifecta of social contract theory and kind of like theories of the state of nature of like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, right? Like that's always like kind of the trifecta. And I can remember as an undergrad in my history of political thought class being like really feeling that Hobbes was super lame. And then when I got to Rousseau, I was like, oh, this is so exciting. He's kind of like turning Hobbes on his head. And I think he's fun for kind of turning that idea on its head. Although I do think that there's, not to make this about Hobbes, but I think Hobbes does also get a little bit misunderstood, like in terms of, I don't think that he literally thinks that everyone's trying to kill each other in the state of nature. It's more that because there's nothing to guarantee safety, you're just scared all the time. You don't have security, but it doesn't mean that you're literally at war all the time. He calls it a state of war because it's a state of perpetual insecurity, as opposed to like actually like fighting and brutish. I mean, he does say the thing like the nasty, brutish, and short thing. But anyway, that's kind of neither here nor there. But like when I teach this to students, like because I lectured on the Discourse on Inequality this summer, so like a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, I mean, I think it raises interesting questions. I think students get excited because it gets to the core question of what is the nature of a human being? What makes them happy? What makes them degrade? What makes them unhealthy? And I think Rousseau has like a very specific theory about why like we have social ills, and it's based on a certain very strange view of human nature. And he does this by, as Eric was saying, a kind of thought experiment about what the state of nature was, right? Which, as opposed to Hobbes being a state of perpetual insecurity, for Rousseau, it's like not quite a utopia, but a state where everyone has what they need, like each according to their abilities, each according to their needs or whatever. And they are strangely individualistic though, which is very odd. They like roam around alone and like bump into each other and are kind of nice to each other, but don't form collective bonds until later. Nature provides everything that they need. And I think like, whereas Hobbes thinks that like the main human emotion that drives people is fear, for Rousseau, it's pity, or what we might today call compassion.
Yeah, he uses those terms.
Exactly. So like for him, he thinks that like it's just as strong, if not a stronger emotion than fear, that when we see another being suffering, we find it intolerable. And he even, at the beginning of the discourse, I don't know if either of you noticed this, but he has a bit of an animal rights argument at the very beginning of it, where he says, when you see like that we can see them suffering, and unless we have a concrete reason for wanting to, like for example for hunger, like it's not really justified to harm animals because we can recognize their suffering as we can recognize it in another human being.
Yeah,
there's a lot. It's a rich
that.
text. It's a really rich text. Like I'll stop talking, but like there's a lot of good, interesting stuff that does get students excited. And there's a lot also that anticipates Marx, that anticipates Kant, that like Rousseau.
Not even anticipates, produces.
Yeah,
indirectly.
produces. So it's extremely influential.
I was going to say this stuff is like the germ of Darwinian thinking, because they're thinking about now, they're starting to move towards like an evolutionary stage theory kind of view of society, where you go from like a primordial state to a more developed state to like a final advanced state. I mean, it's definitely like the beginning of evolutionary thinking, at least like social evolutionism. And that from there, you can imagine it's just a short leap to Malthus and economic theory, and then Darwin's application of that to populations of animals.
Well, this is a bit anachronistic because there was no right or left wing until right after he died, I guess. But he's kind of the left wing response to Hobbes and Locke, in a sense. And I was trying to decide here: is Rousseau an alpha male or is Rousseau a sigma male? Because besides what he wrote, he impregnated. If you're French, you're probably a descendant of Rousseau, because he impregnated people and left all the babies on the church steps all over Europe because he was practicing his freedom.
It's like a little Attila the Hun.
For this episode, I cracked open my copy of Closing of the American Mind, because speaking of, this is written by Alan Bloom, right? And I mean, even reading his account of Rousseau made me so sad that there are no intelligent conservative intellectuals anymore. Because if you look at their roster, it's like at the best of the conservative intellectuals, it's a Dunning-Kruger convention. But most of them are just shrill tie-wearing clowns trying to grift boomers out of their retirement funds. But Alan Bloom was different. Alan Bloom, what did he die in, like mid-90s?
He said some incredibly stupid stuff in the Closing of the American Mind, but yeah.
For sure. He wrote an entire book on Rousseau, and yeah, this brought back to mind, like, I read Emile by Rousseau.
He translated Emile when he was a professor at the University of Toronto, actually.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought he was at U of Chicago.
He was at Cornell, and then he spent 10 years, all of the 1970s, he was at the University of Toronto.
And then University of he went to
University of Chicago.
Okay.
No, then he left and went to teach at the University of Chicago after Toronto.
But I'm pretty sure he went there because he writes in this romantic, flowery language about the spires and all that. So
this is actually why University of Toronto has a weird reputation for Straussians, because Alan Bloom was there for 10 years.
Oh, I didn't know
That's why, yeah. And there's this residual from that.
I think he gives a great summary of Rousseau's importance. The main thing that Alan Bloom is, like, I think patently incorrect about is he thinks that history is just run by ideas and has basically no materiality. So putting that aside, this is what he says. Although Hobbes and Locke teach that man is rational, Rousseau's rationality is in the service of passions or sentiments, which are more fundamental than reason. So think of it, we're in the Enlightenment here. So everyone's like, science is going to improve humanity endlessly. And Rousseau goes, nah, feelings, imagination, that shit. So back to the
he
text.
does.
Thinking through their position that man is naturally a solitary being results in the recognition that speech, the condition of reason, is not natural to man. Enlightenment misunderstands both reason and feeling. Rousseau's reasoning and rhetoric were so potent that hardly anyone who thought, as well as many who did not, could avoid his influence. I think he's speaking of the Jacobins there. After him, community, virtue, compassion, feeling, enthusiasm, the beautiful and the sublime, and even imagination, the banished faculty, had their innings against modern philosophy and science. And then he goes on to say that freedom in Rousseau, for the first time, freedom instead of reason became the defining feature of man. And then, of course, he caused the French Revolution because those people who did not think took it up. Oops.
Oh, that's how Rousseau influenced Hegel, by the way, on freedom. Hegel's account of freedom.
And Kant on imagination.
Yes, and Kant on freedom, too.
Marx on private property as the root of all inequality. It's like the list goes on.
I mean, even the phrasing This is, I think, more in the social contract, like the idea of living under a rule that you put to yourself, that you obey a rule. That's like in Kant, and that is verbatim in Rousseau in the social contract, right? That like you live according to rules that you set for yourself, right? And that you can collectively, and that freedom is obeying those rules that are freely chosen.
And he's just a good writer too.
He's extremely influential, like, and he's kind of covertly influential.
Victor and I are on this train together, but Eric said, I thought this was all bullshit. So before we get into appraising his value to intellectual history, I want to hear why Eric hates him so much.
I mean, I disagree with Rousseau on a bunch of stuff, but yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Go ahead, Eric.
I mean, I disagree with, like, I might be on your side on some.
Raise them expectations. The part that grated me, I mean, there's a few things that bugged me a little bit. And first of all is probably just something I'm ignorant about, is that, like, as a response to a question about the origin of inequality, I don't really understand how we're supposed to take this answer. He says that, like, this is a thought experiment. This is not meant to be real history. I'm not telling you what really happened. I'm engaging in a kind of
speculation.
Like a speculative kind of method for
parable,
getting
maybe.
to the, like a parable. That's what Wengrow and Graeber call it. They say this is a parable that he's telling, but it's a way of getting to the answer to this question about the origin of inequality. And it makes, like, he's like, I'm going to put the facts aside away because the facts aren't going to help us. But then throughout, I see him just making all of these facts up. like he says, a cat sitting on a pile of meat wouldn't eat it and it would die first. And I'm like, I've seen cats eat meat. Yeah, he said, well, he was making the distinction between free choice and instinct, decisions based on free choice. So as a human, we could, like, see that we're starving and we could choose the right food, even if it's not like our preferred food. Whereas animals, by instinct, have a certain set of things they eat. And even if they're in an abundance of things they don't eat, they won't try to eat them because they're just they're machines guided by instinct. Like, I mean, he's like, I'm going to put all the facts aside. I'm not going to do all that, but then I'm just going to make up my own shit, whatever fits into this. Like, that stuff kind of grated me. As I'm going along, he just makes claims that I'm like, that's not true. Or, like, if you really want people to come after you and add to this and, like, go further in this direction than you, then I feel like he's putting up a lot of roadblocks to that behavior.
No, you're totally misquoting, first of all. He says, a cat on a heap of grain, not on a heap of meat.
Sure, he gives the example of a cat on a heap of fruit or grain,
which they do not eat.
Sure, okay, well, but that's not a fact, right? Because we're not arguing from facts or anything real in the history of the world. We're just doing this as a thought experiment.
No, he said pigeon will never eat meat even if they're starving. A cat will never eat grain even if they're starving.
And even if he's wrong about that, which I'm pretty sure I've seen pigeons eat more fucked up shit than the choicest meats. Even if he's wrong about that, what does it take away? Because his argument's not based on these things anyway. But it just, these claims that he just makes kind of just felt very. I don't know.
So did so many people in that era.
Cite your fucking sources, man. Like, what the hell are you making this based on? Clearly, you've never had cats before, dude. Clearly, you've never lived in a city that has pigeons in it, dude.
Have you ever seen a pigeon eat meat or a cat eat grain?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure cat food has grain in it. Pretty sure all cat food's got grain in it. Yes, they do eat a higher percentage of protein and fat, but they do eat carbs. In fact, dogs don't naturally eat. They've determined dogs don't naturally eat grain. You can feed them a grain-free diet, but you can also give them food that is like 40% grain, right? Like their diets are pretty malleable.
But a dog is not a pigeon, or I don't know. This is a stupid thing to even have.
It's the whole thing about. Well, no, because it's his primary thing, right? He makes a distinction between humans and animals. What is the difference? One chooses and refuses by instinct. The other chooses and refuses from an act of free will. And then that gets us right to the core of what he's going to be talking about. Humans act out of free will. That's how we make choices. So the will, animals don't have will because they're just compelled in various directions by their instincts. They don't have this human quality of free agency, which he calls it, which is going to be like a fundamental, human quality, think post-humanism. We're distinguishing humans from animals very sharply here so we can make our argument. So that's what nature gives humans and animals the same sort of stuff, but humans also have these other things that separate them, right? So free will, right? That's his that stupid example I was bringing up, kind of cattily, was his example of how they choose and refuse by instinct and not free will. They will die. I mean, it is a cat will. You can easily like piss a cat off, then it'll stop eating, and then it'll like get really sick and possibly die. Like they will, fucking pout themselves to death. They will go on hunger strike. But is that just, I don't know, like that as a way of distinguishing humans from animals, that seems, okay, fine. I give it to that. This is all, I'm not shitting on this. It's interesting. It's clever, lots of turns of phrase. I will talk about things that I like about it too, I swear.
Well, aside from the cats eating grain, the overall point of the thing, as opposed to everyone around him, the encyclopedists, Locke and Hobbes, as we've mentioned, everyone at the time is saying science and civilization, advancing enlightenment, etc., blah, blah, blah. He's pretty much the first one to say, you know what, science, not that great, pretty good.
Yeah.
Doesn't really answer human questions. Civilization, that's not natural. That's unnatural. Are these causes of happiness and freedom in the world? No, actually, they're causes of the opposite. They are the cause of unhappiness and inequality. And then, like, the main quotation that you got to remember from Rousseau is from what we read, the Discourse on Inequality. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people stupid enough to believe him, was the real founder of society. But how many crimes, wars, murders, horrors, misfortunes might have saved us if they just said, beware of listening to this guy. There's no such thing as private property. So private property is the root of all evil. And I don't know about the cats and the grain, but he was the first to say it, which is huge.
Okay, but really interesting thing about this text, backing up from property, is like the problem is much deeper than that. The problem is language. The problem is our ability to use language to abstract away from nature. Philosophy is a problem. There's actually a quote I was trying to find where he's literally like shitting on like thinking. He's just like, it ruined us basically.
Well, yeah, I've never even heard anyone say this, and I disagree with it probably, but he says language is unnatural.
Yeah, which is really bizarre.
Well, that's like he makes this distinction between natural inequality and moral or political inequality. Like that's the big thing. Two kinds of inequality. The natural, which is just, what is it? Difference in age, health, strength, qualities of mind, whatever. And then moral or political inequality, which depends on conventions, like social conventions. It's established, it's instituted, it's authorized. So he makes that distinction and then says there's nothing really, if we engage in this thought experiment now, like let's start thinking about the state of nature. Well, we can assume that we are naturally the same. We have 2 feet. We use our hands in relatively the same ways. We look around us. We take in what's around. He says there's not much difference there, but the political moral inequality part, that's what's really going to separate us from them, because they don't have, a social society. They don't have an institutional basis. They don't have, they don't have human prescribed laws. They don't have that stuff. So in the state of nature, they are like morally developed, stripped of all, as he calls it, their supernatural knowledge and their artificial faculties. We would be just like them in the state of nature. That's kind of where he starts it all. So that's like where we're imagining, and he says this state of nature may never have existed. We may doubt if it had ever existed, but this is just the direction his thinking is going in with it. And again, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
But and I got to get to the end of it and ask all the so what questions, but like as far as it goes, like it's pretty cool the way he's turning around Hobbes and saying, just because humans don't have an idea of virtue doesn't make them all bad, because we don't have an idea of vice either in the state of nature. So there is really no distinction between good or bad to be made there. But what people tend to do is they take ideas that have developed in social history through commerce and communication, and then they truck them, they shift them back onto this state of nature, and then start making assumptions about how they think or what their intellectual capacities are based on what we know now. He says that's kind of wrong. So he's trying to sort of almost do like a historical epichet, like bracket all that, and then just start with a pure state of nature where there's no language, there's no society, there's no law, there's no nothing. We only have what distinguishes us naturally from animals, one of which is being free will. And one of is a capacity for language, not actual language. That comes later. Spends many paragraphs on that. But that's how he kind of goes into it. He starts it off all hypothetical, all kind of just thought experimenty.
Yeah, I mean, it's speculative, but I think he's raising really fundamental questions about what are the conditions that lead us to be the way that we are, right? Like, so, I mean, obviously, like from a kind of empiricist evidentiary perspective, like it's going to be lacking, but I think like the point is just to be like, okay, what are the things that lead to envy and competition and misery? And I think like he has a profound account that, I mean, I don't agree with it, but there's grains of insight throughout all of it. And I think, at one point I was mentioning before, he talks about like language. So I think it's whatever edition I have, it's like 107. He's like, it's evident, it is reason that engenders self-love and reflection that strengthens it. It is reason that makes man shrink into himself. It is reason that makes him keep aloof from everything that can trouble or afflict him. It is philosophy that destroys his connection to other men. It is in consequence of her dictates that he mutters to himself at the sight of another in distress, "You may perish, I'm fine." So basically, like he's saying, it's philosophy and abstract thought that gets in the way. Remember I was saying before that for him, compassion is like this originary emotion. For him, it's like abstract thought philosophy that gets in the way of that and lets us convince ourselves that, oh, whatever, rationalize and be like, I don't need to help that person. I don't need to do that. And it's like he says all those things, abstract knowledge, abstract thought, separate us. And I think, when he talks about the original man in the state of nature as this kind of individualist creature, which is very bizarre. I mean, it's clear that humans were not individualist ever, right? They were always social creatures. Like that's total bullshit. But I think what he has in mind is this kind of pure unmediated unity with nature, right? It's like you're enmeshed in nature and you have all the needs that you want and you feel your emotions and like your nature in a way that is purely unmediated, right? So like that's why I think he starts with language as something that gets in the way, because behind it, he thinks there's compassion. So we see another person suffering. We just help them. We don't need to think about it. And I think this is like a really interesting kind of profound way of thinking about it. And I mean, it even reminds me of kind of a Lacanian account, right? Like, I mean, Lacan's whole view is like language comes in and, stops us from like creates this lacking that we're continually trying to recover. And I think you could do an interesting Lacanian reading of Rousseau as Rousseau offering an account of like this kind of originary wholeness that would have been before language kind of came in and split the subject, right? So I think he's giving this kind of pre-linguistic account and then talking about what's lost by having linguistic abstract reason come in and create this level of mediation that then eventually leads to civilization, eventually leads to new desires, right? Exactly like, again, I'm not saying he's a Lacanian, but I mean, there's a resemblance here, right? For Lacan, it's like creates new desires that we try to satisfy perpetually and suffer in a way as a result of them. And for Rousseau, it's like this mediation, then kind of an abstract reasoning creates the possibilities for us to have societies and communities with other people, and then they get more complex. And the more complex they get, the more we start to find reasons to be envious and angry at other people, right? And I mean, then the story goes on from there, but I'll stop there.
And even more practically on the same line, Montessori schools?
Yeah.
You know what that? Well, in case anyone doesn't know,
I don't know their curriculum, but I know
a Montessori school is like you take care of animals and grow plants and do stuff outside. This was directly inspired by Rousseau because this brought to mind because you're talking about this abstract language or even like maths or sciences, the way that we sit in desks and learn this abstractly and then get tested on it. Montessori education, I think it was. What I forget her name. Her name was Montessori, and that's why Montessori schools are named as such. But the thing is, you have to follow your passion, otherwise you're not going to learn anything. And this abstract way of thinking, rational thinking, is the thing that gets in the way of the passions. So if you're passionate about reason, then good for you. You're going to do well in school. If you're not, then you're not going to do well in school. But Montessori education is about getting your hands on stuff, getting involved in this kind of originary state where you let sentiment guide pedagogy instead of letting pedagogy, control sentiment by sitting at a desk and, learning things abstractly. So this is it has like cash outs, lots of cash outs.
Here's where you're saying, earlier Alan Bloom, and now you're talking about passions again. So he says, he thinks of passion as the driving force behind reasoning and understanding. Like that's what passion does. Is it, it's the impulse behind the development of knowledge. Yeah. He says here's the quote. This would be nice to go with what you were saying with Bloom too. The human understanding, he says, is greatly indebted to the passions, which it is universally allowed are also much indebted to the understanding. Okay, so there's a bit of a two-way street there. It is by the activity of the passions that our reason is improved, for we desire knowledge only because we wish to enjoy. And it is impossible to conceive any reason why a person who has neither fears nor desires should give himself the trouble of reasoning. Without fears and desires, we shouldn't trouble ourselves with reasoning. Passions have sort of two ways they work. We cannot desire or fear anything except from the idea we have of it, the idea we have of it on the one hand, or the simple impulse of nature on the other hand. Now, savage man is destitute of all intelligence. Savage people are stupid and simple and okay, fine. They can't have any passions based on the ideas they have of something. They can only have passions based on simple impulse of nature.
Yes, and that's better for him.
But either way, so that's going to be the germ, I guess. You have these simple impulses, and they are the sort of behind your passions. And eventually, you're able to fulfill your needs. So, like, why go any further? Why think about things when you can fulfill these impulses? It's when these impulses sort of complexify and present us with problems. That's when thinking has to sort of begin, and that's when everything kind of starts going to shit as well. But if you don't have any ideas, you can't have passions based on ideas. You can only have passions based on natural impulse, like the desire to eat, such that the savage man's desires never go beyond his physical wants, quote unquote. So that's how passions fits into the story. Anyway, I think it's very well said. You should not ignore the role of the passions in knowledge and understanding, nor vice versa.
Kind of what the thing that you're missing a little bit, though, is that the savage man is happier than the civilized one.
Yeah. That's his point.
You're saying this as like, because obviously he's being chauvinistic, of course, towards like what he calls primitive civilization or primitive social arrangement, but he also thinks that they're more happy.
No, he thinks they're better. I mean, that's where the noble savage thing comes from. I mean,
like they're better off. They're simpler morally and politically, but then that is also like the part of their strength. But
it's better.
You know,
They're
it's like
also
an undifferentiated kind of mental state they live in as well, which is sort of, I mean, it's a double-edged sword kind of, because you're quote destitute of every species of intelligence in that state, which so you can't even really grasp your own situation in that sense, and yet you're more content because you're not, you know, why think if it's just going to cause you problems anyway.
Well, this is why this is why he I think this is where his individualism comes in too, because he doesn't just think that like you're more content, but he also thinks you're more self-sufficient. Like, so he thinks that like modern human beings and civilization makes us have all these passions and weaknesses, but it's like when you're solitary and you just like, you can hunt and find what you want, you can eat the fruits and you can fuck someone when they come along, and like you have everything that you need and you are fully self-sufficient. So like, and that for him is like, I think the pinnacle of the human animal is like this individualist being able to take advantage of everything you want. Now the story does get slightly complicated because when he gives his story about the development of civilization, he also kind of talks about a more realistic kind of intermediary stage, which is where he talks about the rustic huts. He's like, you know, actually like maybe the most realistic and best state is when we lived in rustic huts with other people, small communities, because it was like kind of a nice combination of still being really self-sufficient, but still enjoying those kinds of passions that I think you're talking about, Eric, where like you have community with other people, and there is like some abstract thinking, but it's really like a much simpler, quainter time. I'll see if I can find the quote where he talks about rustic huts, because like it's kind of an important thing for him.
And then we get all of civilization with its conveniences, with its like division of labor, especially where you don't have to do everything for yourself. You get other people to do things, and then you do things for them, and then you're less happy.
And you're more dependent on others. So I found it, by the way. So he says, okay, as long as men remained satisfied with their rustic huts, as long as they were content with clothes made of skin of animals, sewn with thorns and fish bones, as long as they continued to consider feathers and shells as sufficient ornaments and paint their bodies different colors, blah, 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 you know, and stuck to such arts as did not require the joint endeavors of several hands, right? That's key. So it's like, as long as they live in these communities where all their arts were things that one person could do, they lived free, healthy, honest, and happy, as much as their nature would admit, and continue to enjoy with each other all the pleasures of independent intercourse. So the idea there is like, you can find this state where like you are living with others, but everyone in that community is still self-sufficient. Everything they have, one person can build. And yes, Pills is absolutely right. It all goes wrong when you have a division of labor.
Division of labor and property.
Property
Private
and a division
property.
of labor. But the division of labor and private property kind of go hand in hand, because it's like the division of labor is possible because of private property to a certain extent, because they're able to like build things and harvest things at a more mass scale, right? So it's like, and that obviously those two things kind of go together. And that's basically the moment when humans became beta simp cucks who can't do anything for themselves.
I think private property comes from agriculture too.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like
this is what, like, if we get to the Graeber Wengrow book probably next week, this is where they say this story is kind of wrong. And of course, there's holes in the story. It's a little bit wrong, but the significance, the context of what he's saying, that's so important. The first political philosopher, the first any type of philosopher to ever say, you know what? Civilization is not better for us. It's actually worse. And that's why he's so significant, because so many thinkers after him pick this up in different directions and say, society, this part is bad, that part is negative, we have no freedom. So everything that comes after is a result of him for the first time being a critical theorist. He's the first critical theorist.
Yes, he's the first real critique of modernity.
Yeah, I can appreciate that hugely. Like you don't need to think too hard to understand that he's saying like these are social problems, right? They're socially created problems, which is, a very good sociological preparation for Marx, because all the issues that we are currently facing, many of them, including climate change, whatever, it's due to social activity, right? They're not natural problems, as we would natural in lots of quotes. But it's a blessing and a curse. He's the origin of that stuff, but he also emphasizes these ideas like, there are certain people who still continue to exist in something like a state of nature, and like he kicks off a lot of bad stereotypes. So you got to take the good with the bad here. And that's what The Dawn of Everything is going to emphasize, because what this narrative, there's lots here and it's interesting, but it kind of collapses into a caricature where either you have these perfect egalitarian societies in the state of nature, and then somehow agriculture happens, and then private property comes along, and then you get inequality. And they're going to question that story. They're going to say there was inequality in the state of nature, there was inequality after. And there was equality on both sides as well. And there's no reason to think that inequality emerged at some point. And even worse, to think that it emerged at some point in a linear evolutionary narrative that goes from villages, cities to states, or goes from agriculture to this and that, like these different, evolutionary ecology or social evolutionism, or any of these different linear narratives. He's going to say those are all wrong. I mean, they're not wrong, but they present disconnected elements of the picture.
I mean, basically. I agree with you. It's just, I think you have to hold these like older, 18th century texts to like a slightly different standard, in the sense of like, it's not about excusing at all like the stereotyping, but it's more like even on the speculative stuff. It's just, this is, I mean, all these fucking thinkers from that time said crazy things about
they didn't even have archaeology as a discipline. It's kind of, where do you expect them to get their evidence from?
Hobbes' shit is crazy. Like all these people writing at this time were crazy in what, like the claims that they would make.
But very bold, they just like, they each have a theory of psychology that intermixes with their political philosophy. They go into like aesthetic. It's just, you can do anything, go anywhere, and no one's going to be correcting you.
They have speculative courage that does not exist anymore.
But also, I think we read them way too linearly. Like, people do this with a Hobbes, especially. Like Hobbes thought it was like, no, he says at the beginning, I'm not even saying that it was really like this. I'm telling you a parable about human nature and why we need the king in his case.
No, that was what I was trying to say. Yeah, I'm not saying I had a problem with them directly. I'm saying that the two narratives that Rousseau and Hobbes have gotten us have flattened out and become almost like an either or. Either, the real state of nature, quote unquote, the narratives have been literalized as well. They're not just taken as parables anymore. They're taken as like literal guesses at what's happened. And they've flattened out. So you have these two options: state of nature, bad, society, good, or state of nature, good and innocent and egalitarian, society, introduces all these issues and stratification and inequality. And he's saying those are the two choices. If those are the two choices, then they're both wrong.
Yeah, sure.
But he's saying they weren't even presented as a problem like that by the original thinkers too. They vindicate them on that ground, that people are reading them wrong and literalizing what they're saying.
I agree. I think that's on us for being bad readers, because we take everything as a claim, position, argument, as opposed to, let's sit back and consider human
it's like
history.
the same thing. It's the same thing with reading Marx, right? Like he makes a lot of claims about, he hedges what he's doing in Capital quite a bit. Like I'm interested in capitalism in its pure form, which doesn't really exist, but like, and then people forget those qualifiers and then they just take the word as describing reality. And that's when it becomes, that's when the misreading can get a little bit dangerous. Because you're starting to take what they're saying as historical fact rather than, again, a kind of thought experiment kind of thing. So like I can appreciate these texts to that extent. And most of your defenses have been sort of the broader, he's the first to do that, or like look at this tradition and that tradition that they've led to. But then I put my eyes on the page and I start reading and they glaze over because it just feels like he's recycling, again, not his fault, but he's just recycling cliches. What are cliches to us now? Anyway, to them, sure, it was fucking wonderful and new, but to me, this is just like the walruses in South Park pulling out a bunch of stereotypes and sticking them into a narrative, and it's to that extent, it's bullshit. But to the extent that it's like, social philosophy, social theory, like, sure, great. I probably have a job today because of Rousseau. So thanks, buddy.
Yeah, he invented the social sciences also, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of just think it's.
He starts off by saying the three inscriptions on the Temple of Delphi are probably better than all the social theory and moral theory we've come up so far, which is like, what were they? Know thyself. The first, the moment you make a promise is the moment calamity is going to happen, and all in moderation. Nothing too much. I think it was.
I mean,
he said those tenets are better than all our moral theories so far. He's trolling though. He's trolling.
I mean, I totally agree with your critiques. Like, obviously, I'm not even defending his claims. I mean, his claims are clearly wrong, but I just feel like when I'm dealing with people in this era, it's like, what are the gems that you can, get out of this way of thinking, right? And to me, it's like a critique of modernity. It's even getting into the deep philosophical level of like, what role does abstraction play in our psyche, right? And like, how could that contribute to unhappiness? And then it's also asking us to think through, in the critique of modernity, but specifically like why, like what effect does civilization have? And just like question, narratives of progress, like all these things. I think it gives us early ammunition for those things. And like, I guess that's just a way of saying like he was the first to do it. But I think there's also like interesting, valuable work to be done from just like getting to those gems and being like, look, they were thinking about these things back then. And to some extent, some of the ways that they're being framed, well, on the one hand, there's like incredibly stereotyping and like stupid ways of doing it. But also there's like a kind of speculative courage, as I was saying before, of like a way of just like thinking about things comprehensively that we don't do anymore. And I think that's fun. It's fun for that reason.
I wonder about him getting second place because this thing was submitted to an essay contest and he got second. So if it got second, it can't be like that outside of the norm or that deviant or subversive, maybe. I would guess. I got this had to be like a current of thought in some way, at least.
Yeah, I forgot to check what the reception was like, but
well, he's the one who made it onto the canon,
Yeah, he did make it onto the canon, so that's good. I mean, and if we had more time, I think it would be interesting to talk about how like what he tries to do in the social contract, which is like basically come up with a modern solution to all these terrible social ills, which ends up also being totally insane, like and contradictory. Like, I mean, the social contract, it's like everyone needs to agree to the general will, but they can also be wrong about what the general will is if like they don't agree with it. It like makes no fucking sense.
Well, Robespierre took it. Didn't Burke have a whole bunch to say about Rousseau for like causing the French Revolution, which is in his mind the worst thing that has ever happened? Yeah.
I also lectured on Burke recently, and it was fun. He does shit on Rousseau quite a bit, but one thing that they kind of have in common, interestingly, is like they both kind of hate abstract thought for different reasons. Like Rousseau hates it because it brings us to like calamity, but Burke hates it because he thinks that people who do things in the name of principle or ideas are like really idiots, and that you should be that you have to take into account the context, the material circumstances. and that like the French Revolution was a disaster because they're all naive about the material circumstances of the time, and we're just obsessed with stupid principle or like lofty principles like freedom and equality that like you don't think about how to actually put them into practice.
The first leftist purity test, the French Revolution.
They were short on bread and that sort of stuff. I mean, I just want to emphasize reading these texts on their own terms and with a historical grain of salt, I guess, would have been the better preface, because this has led to some, amazing developments and some nasty shit too, or at least some frustrating and intractable kinds of like narratives, like the state of nature thing being kind of taken a bit too literally sometimes, which is a problem. We should read these texts on their own terms. And he says right near the beginning, the investigations we may enter into in treating this subject must not be considered as historical truths, but only as mere conditional and hypothetical reasonings, rather calculated to explain the nature of things, which I don't understand how you can do that without historical truth, but okay, we'll give him that. Then to ascertain their actual origin. It's rather to explain the nature of things than to ascertain their actual origin, right? He's not looking for the moment or the historical moment these things all started. He's just trying to, say, if it was this way, then how would it have happened? Like, there's something wrong with like the, everybody's vicious and then society makes everything all right kind of. What if we kind of thought about this a different way? What would come out of it? And then so he makes all these distinctions we kind of went over. There's a lot of them, supernatural gifts versus natural gifts, artificial, natural, all that stuff. And he makes these and he posits them and you think, okay, well, what's the warrant for that? Like, what are you basing this like enormous distinction between humans and animals on? Like, for instance, like, I mean, it's important because it drives his whole story, but okay, but take it on these terms as a thought experiment, then it becomes very, very interesting. But don't do what the modern big history writers do and like feel like you have to choose between Hobbes and Rousseau, because they're not. They're like, think of them as...
I totally agree with that.
Think of them as machinic processes.
I don't think anyone writes that. There are no Hobbesian Rousseauians anymore, are there?
I mean, there's probably
what we're going to read next week is going to contradict you on that point exactly, especially when we look at his quotes from Steven Pinker.
Oh, well,
Pinker says,
if you want to include
or
Steven
Jared
Pinker,
Diamond's the Guns, Germs, and Steel guy. The Guns, Germs, and Steel guy is a perfect example of him. I think he's a modern day Rousseauian, and he says, sorry, anarchists, if you thought that, if you thought that the state of nature and egalitarianism is going to be, a good thing to fight for, well, think again, because we need society. Like, he kind of says that sort of stuff. We need hierarchy. We need authority.
I don't know if they say that. I think he says that those things are spontaneous and unavoidable. Not that we need them. They're just unavoidable.
Is Diamond 2012, large populations can't function without leaders who make decisions, executives who carry out the decisions, and bureaucrats who administer the decisions and laws. Alas, for all you readers who are anarchists and dream of living without any state government, those are the reasons why your dream is unrealistic.
Well, that's
You'll have to
true.
find some tiny band or some tiny tribe willing to accept you, where no one is a stranger, where kings, presidents, and bureaucrats are unnecessary.
Well, that's got to be true for large populations.
And so Diamond and Fukuyama kind of are on the same page about that sort of stuff.
I mean, that's got to be true. Like, it depends what you define a large population, but like a nation state scale population.
Well,
I mean,
again, this is one of the things they say. A deep, deep assumption we make is that large populations require centralized government. That's a huge. They're going to point this out as like a major, major assumption that loads of these kinds of like writers make. Francis Fukuyama, Jared Diamond, Steven Pinker. A lot of them all actually make the same kinds of assumptions about these things, and they make the same assumptions about Rousseau and Hobbes.
Well, I think you need to make an assumption like based on what we know, and then I think the burden of proof is kind of on the people who want to say that that's not the case, right? Like, because like all of our firsthand experience with history shows that to be true. So like I think it's justified to make that assumption, and then it's kind of, if you want to come in and say that's wrong, well, fine,
Well, that's what
Graeber
they're
and whatever.
doing
That's
here.
what the
They're-
purpose
they're-
of the book is. Yeah.
That's
Cool.
the purpose. They're saying there's been a lot of stuff going on in archaeology in the last few decades that people seem to be completely ignoring. It only goes around in specialist circles. This book is to bring us up to date and tell us why the actual facts of history contradict these sorts of ideas.
Sure. I'm just saying. I'm just defending the fact that it's okay that it makes sense to make that assumption. I'm not saying that for sure that assumption is wrong. I'm just saying
Examine
that
those assumptions first.
Sure.
And then,
I mean, sure.
You mean the way they put it is better. We'll get to that next week. Rousseau, what did he have to go on? Like he talks about comparative anatomy and how it's in such a baby state that he can't use it for this.
I will say going into next week. I mean, one thing I wanted to say quickly, I think Eric and I were talking in chat like a few days ago, like, I was saying that Rousseau is kind of like a proto-anarcho-primitivist, and I hope you can see what I meant by that, right? Like, clearly he's kind of saying that like nature is bad, or something.
You know what I thought? He could go that way, or he could also go libertarian. Like he's right on that a forked division.
Anti-authoritarianism.
Well, then what he does argue in the social contract ends up being none of those things. Like it just ends up being like a weird kind of collectivist. But in anticipation of next week, like I did read, I remember a while ago, the first bit of that Dawn of Everything book. And yeah, it was interesting. I'm going to reread it. But like, I don't know. I find myself to be generally a skeptic when people try to make broad sweeping claims based on anthropological evidence. There's just so much bullshit. Like people make so many bullshit claims. There's like a long tradition of people selectively choosing for whatever conclusion they want to make, right? Like I think conservatives will cherry pick certain kinds of anthropological evidence. Left-wingers will, I don't know. We'll see. I mean, maybe I'll be impressed, but in general, like I find myself being kind of like, oh, maybe, I don't know. Depends how you read the evidence.
Yeah. I think you'll be happy to know that you basically just paraphrased something they laid out. Exactly.
Okay, cool.
He says, these people tend to take the evidence, but then they don't go to other disciplines and they interpret the data very narrowly. And he says it's time to, do a bit of synthesizing, basically. That's what they're thinking about. Get all the evidence and synthesize.
Despite the criticism of Rousseau, they want to be more like Rousseau in telling a different grand narrative from the accepted grand narrative. But they're still giving purposiveness, or at least critiquing the purposiveness of history that every single one of these authors engages in. And of course, they would. Even though he's an anti-Enlightenment thinker, he's still an Enlightenment thinker. He's an Enlightenment thinker, Rousseau is.
Yeah.
Speaking of, did you know that he was the one who coined the phrase, not Marie Antoinette, but him, let them eat cake?
Let them eat cake.
Oh,
Nice.
really? That's funny. I didn't know that.
And at the time, Marie Antoinette was only 9 years old, but it was brioche. He said, let them eat brioche, a princess said. And then that was later attributed to Marie Antoinette having said it, despite the fact that she was, I don't even think, in France at the time.
Shit happens. Yeah.
Quotable quote. But anyway, I think we are at time. So, based or so? Or are you not convinced, Eric?
I think, yeah, I'll say he's based, but he's not. His base is pretty thin.
I mean, if you read him like a contemporary, then it's like an insane person. But if you read him in the context of who he was writing against and with, and what he was saying as opposed to them, it's a lot of shit here.
After reading this, I think I can read a lot of contemporaries as 18th century authors. That's for sure. Because a lot of these are very familiar tropes in terms of. So it's not like.
Well, he's an anti-STEM lord. Like even the stuff about imagination, where he's like, imagination is what we were talking about last week, for example. Imagination is not only something to be banished, it's the primary mover for like any human creative activity and any human activity at all. If you take away imagination, then humans are not human anymore, as opposed to reason being this primary function that all people practice in and strive to accomplish in their little civilized university classrooms.
That's interesting because he says here as well, every general idea is purely intellectual. If the imagination meddles with it ever so little, the idea immediately becomes particular. So if he's saying the imagination makes us focused on particular things, general ideas are like basically irrelevant until the imagination takes hold of them and puts them to particular kinds of uses and things, right? Like his example is, trace in your mind the image of a tree and you'll never attain your end. It's like, I don't know. It's a weird, I don't know what's going on with some of his empirical theory here, but sure. The overall message is inequality is an intractable element of modern society. And this is why. We're going to learn why.
All right, let's wrap it up there. Don't go outside, guys. Take care of yourself, unless you want to.
Yeah, don't touch any fucking grass today.
Or unless you're on the West Coast or whatever.
Unless it's cannabis.
Is that why it's so dark outside? Is it because of the...
It doesn't seem that dark to me.
I don't know. It was raining, but it's dull and hazy out there.
I can see blue skies literally from my window. So
really?
I don't know.
Oh, you're on the other side of town from us.
I'm facing west. I can't see shit.
I see gray only. Gray only. Anyway, listeners, please enjoy the continual toilet flush of civilization. It seems like civilization collapses every month now instead of every generation. But stay tuned.
All right.
One of those boards up days without collapse. One.
All right, later, guys. Bye.